The rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is, should the Prevention of Terrorism Act be repealed and a more progressive law be enacted? To discuss all this and more, we've invited three guests to our studios this evening. Attorney at Law Tyagi Ruwan Pathirana, researcher, Amnesty International; Dr. Pakeswathi Saravanamuthu, Executive Director, Center for Policy Alternatives; Ambika Satguranathan, former Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Let's start off tonight's show with Dr. Pakeswathi Saravanamuthu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives. Dr. Sara, many activists say that the Prevention of Terrorism Act, or the PTA, which was introduced 40 years ago, are a law that enables prolonged arbitrary detention to target minority communities and civil society groups. How far is this statement true?
Well, if you consider the people who have been taken in under PTA, it is definitely true. I mean, today you're getting people from the majority community who were dissenters, key dissenters who've been taken in under the PTA, and in the past we know of scores of Tamils who had the best years of their life robbed from them because they were detained under the PTA. It's a draconian law. It has to be repealed.
So the PTA was introduced in 1979 as an emergency measure, and only one day of parliamentary debate, and the law was enacted in Parliament in Sri Lanka in the year 1979. Do you think that amendments are required for the PTA to be a more progressive one, or do you think the PTA should be repealed once and for all?
Well, the government of Sri Lanka has made a commitment that it will be repealed and replaced. And that, okay, if we need a counter-terror law in this country, it should be one that is consonant with international standards and which meets our international obligations. So I don't think, repealing laws, we seem now to have got into this practice of repealing, tinkering at the edges. This is farcical. It's a bad law. It has to be repealed. And if the reasons for this type of law still hold, then we should come up with something which is a lot better, and as I said, consonant with international standards.
But don't you think, Dr. Sara, given the situation in Sri Lanka, that such an amendment is required in the country?
Well, when you think of who has been convicted under this law, do you really think that it has been fair, that it has been reasonable? This law, in the main, has been used to deprive people of the best years of their life and visit untold suffering on their families. Today, you're having the same thing. We understand that there is detention orders are supposed to be signed, etc., but no lawyers have seen them. The families don't know where the detention orders are. But whatever. I mean, this is ridiculous. At the end of the day, this all functions to the advantage of the state. And so, a Prevention of Terrorism Act, or any kind of counter-terror act, is supposed to protect a population, not a regime.
Dr. Sara, when we speak about the Mahinda Rajapaksa administration, we saw the manner in which how Human Rights Watch reports 109 arrests took place in the year 2021 alone under the Prevention of Terrorism Act in the country. Then we're talking about a progressive government. Now we speak about Ranil Wickremesinghe taking the helm as the head of state, and we expect there to be democracy because the UNP predominantly has championed democracy in Sri Lanka for a considerable time in the country. So given that fact, do you think that civil society organizations and even civil rights activists are appalled the way things are now progressing in the country in terms of human rights?
Of course, they are absolutely appalled and have every right to be so. If they weren't appalled, they shouldn't call themselves civil rights activists. Given what is happening today, given the flimsiest of reasons for using this law, I think it is absolutely ridiculous. You see, the one question that I ask myself is how come a government is using the PTA in the way that it is at this moment when we are days away from the sessions opening in Geneva, where we have made pledges with regard to repealing and replacing the PTA. We are supposed to have a moratorium on using the PTA. What has happened to all of that? What has actually happened to, I mean, do you really believe that these people are terrorists? Because they went into an office or they sat on a bed or they took an iron or whatever? You know, there must be some reasonableness with regard to it. And this is why I say, I mean, you know, you said that, you know, most people believe that the UMP is more democratic than the other parties, etc. That's up for debate. And if it's not up for debate, it should now be reconsidered.
Dr. Sara, Vasanta Mudalige, Hashanta Jivanta Gunatilaka, and Venerable Galveva Siridamathera were today detained for a 90-day period under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. How do you view this?
Sorry, how do you?
How do you view this?
I think it's absolutely scandalous. It's absolutely scandalous, and if I remember correctly, it is probably in violation of the Act itself, no? Because it came too late or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, so, you know, you have a draconian law, you don't even observe it properly. This is going from bad to worse as far as civil and political rights in this country are concerned.
So 2 weeks from now, the Human Rights High Commissioner is supposed to make a submission on Sri Lanka. Won't this be detrimental, the developments in the country at the moment?
Well, I would think so. I would think that in her report, the language that she will use will be strong and will take into account all that has happened. But the key thing is in terms of what the operative paragraphs are going to be, in terms of what the resolution that comes up, what it's going to ask for.
Dr. Sarab, isn't it very surprising that this government, which is now in an economic mess, is putting us through a diplomatic crisis also when it comes to issues of this sort? Because the High Commissioner for Human Rights has been talking about the protection of human rights in the country for many, many years, especially after the end of the conflict in the country. So given that fact, don't you think it's up for the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the President himself, to up their game in terms of protecting the human rights of individuals?
Absolutely. Any government at any time is supposed to do that. That is one of the reasons why we have governments in the first place, you know. And so this is why I said I don't understand as to how this government can be doing this at this time with the sessions in Geneva round the corner. You know, it's incomprehensible to me. If the President, as the Ministry of Defense, is signing off on detention orders, yeah, so he is obviously in the know. He can't claim that he is ignorant of what is happening. So then what is the reason for it? Does he have to pacify or play into the hands of the security establishment?
What does the political hierarchy? What does the political hierarchy in Sri Lanka want to achieve by doing this? Does it want to show that you cannot mess with us? If you mess with us,
we brook no dissent. We brook no dissent, and given the 134 or whoever who voted for the President in Parliament, I suppose he wants to send a message across to them that he and he alone can protect them and provide them security.
So the no-nonsensical attitude is now taking center stage as far as this government is concerned.
Well, you could call it no nonsense, no nonsense, but I would call it something else.
Which is?
Which is totally autocratic.
The Sri Lankan government was appointed in 2019 with the vision, with the rhetoric that dictatorial rule is important to the country. Isn't this what the people want at the end of the day?
Well, let's hold an election and find out. That's the only way of finding out. Because the government can claim that everything it is doing is legal. The issue at heart, the whole point about the Arugala, is about legitimacy. Is it legitimate? And that's the question that has to be answered. And that's the question that has to be answered also because if people are going to have to bear more sacrifices, they need a government who they can trust, who they have confidence in, who will communicate to them. A government that is arresting people like this is not going to inspire that trust and confidence. It's just dividing the population.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parkeso Saranmuthu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives. I now move my attention to Attorney at Law Tyagi Ruan Patirina, researcher, Amnesty International. Thank you very much, Tyagi, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. The South Asia's Director of Amnesty International has said using a draconian anti-terror law to crack down on protesters is a new law for the Sri Lankan government. Now, there's a very strong statement from Amnesty International when it comes to the developments that are taking place in the country. How do you view this statement?
I mean, it came out of Amnesty International, so I agree with it. But, you know, Amnesty International, along with civil society actors for a very long time, has been calling for PTA's repeal. And consecutive governments have promised that they will either repeal it and replace it with some kind of law that would live up to international standards and laws. And even the SLPP government made the same pledges to especially the EU. And after that, they also amended the law very slightly, trying to make it look like they were sort of committed to this promise. But it didn't go all the way. The kind of issues that were there with the laws, for example, the fact that confessions were still admissible as evidence under the PTA, those were crucial issues with the PTA, were still there even after the law was amended earlier this year. And even though the government has been telling the diplomatic community that it hasn't been using the PTA and that there's a informal moratorium on it, they were still signing detention orders earlier this year, like as recently as in March or April. So it's a farce. And of course, for governments that have been saying this for a while they're trying to sort of appease the international community to win their hearts, to keep the GSP plus concessions, for example, it's a new law. And that's what our statement says.
So Tyagi, when I was looking at the news yesterday, I saw how the manner in which the Minister of Foreign Affairs had met the international community to press on the fact that the government is looking at reforming the PTA. And the developments that took place today with regard to signing the detention orders by the head of state in his capacity as the Minister of Defense to have Basanta Mudilige and Jeevanta Gunatilaka and Venerable Galvava Siddharmathera on detention orders. Don't you think in the eyes of the government, I'm playing the devil's advocate here, in the eyes of the government, they need to be very, very stern as to what transpired a few weeks ago in the country? Isn't that important as well?
Absolutely, public security is important. But do we call whatever violence we've seen in the past few months terrorism? We're talking about a law that was in place when the Easter bombings took place. I mean, it's ironically called the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and it served no preventive purpose. We've seen the kind of people who were arrested. Dr. Sarah mentioned some of them, but we've seen Hejaz Hizbullah, we've seen other political prisoners, we've seen Tamil minorities, and then after Easter, there was a lot of Muslims who were affected by the law. So what purpose is it really serving? We also have other draconian laws in the system. We have the Public Security Ordinance. And then later on, of course, there's also other laws you can use, like the Penal Code, like the ICCPR. Is there really a need to use the PTA against protesters who are largely peaceful?
Tyagi, what sort of a message you have for the government at this point of time? I usually pose this question at the latter stage of the show, but I want to pick your brain on what is the message you have for the government in terms of Amnesty International?
It's a mistake. It's a huge mistake. Sri Lanka is unfortunately in this huge economic mess right now, and we are at the mercy of the international community for a lot of assistance. We've seen India step up a lot. We are now appealing to the IMF and Western nations to give us funds and support. And at the same time, we're hugely reliant on the GSP concessions remaining. And they are going to assess it later on in the year. So if this is the context, and if there are protests that are asking for basically economic reform, basically for accountability, to see how did we get here in the first place, they want system change, those are legitimate demands. And in this context, when you go and detain these people for 90 days under the PTA, you're really putting yourself at a precarious position.
So many foreign embassies, missions in Colombo, Tyagi, issued strong statements against the recent developments in Sri Lanka with regard to the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And they've been very, very vociferous with regard to what is going on in the country. Do you think that the international community should be more stern on Sri Lanka right now to ensure that the human rights of every citizen is protected?
Absolutely. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Like just last week, we saw a few tokenistic measures that the government did. For example, they announced that in February 2023, that they would be singing the national anthem at the Independence Day celebrations in Tamil. Then what was the other token? Oh yeah, and then they let the emergency regulations lapse as well. So those are sort of measures they were doing to show the international community that human rights are important to them, because the Human Rights Council sessions are coming up mid-September.
So you're saying the government is not serious about human rights at all?
It's playing a double role because I think it's also torn, because it seems to feel like they need to keep these people in detention to prevent further protests, to secure their own political power, and that's going to be at the economic costs of Sri Lanka, and that's really troubling.
Are you trying to say, Tyagi, that the international community, which should lend a helping hand to Sri Lanka at this point of time, due to its economic crisis that we are facing at the moment, they might even shy away because of such measures that are being taken at the moment?
I believe it might.
Thank you very much. Attorney at Law Tyagi Patirana, Researcher, Amnesty International. I now move my attention to Ambika Satkaranathan, former Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Ambika, interestingly, you've done a lot of work on the PTA and a lot of work in terms of arbitrary detention during your time at the Human Rights Commission of the country. Were you in any way surprised to see the way in which this government came up with this recent development to hold 3 individuals accountable or put them under a detention order for 90 days under the Prevention of Terrorism Act?
Well, yes and no. No, because the system itself, meaning the police, the TID, they are used to abusing the law and they're used to using the PTA. That is part of the culture. So in that sense, I'm not surprised, because that's their first instinct. But I would say I am a bit surprised, because I would think that particularly President Ranil Wickremesinghe would not be so foolhardy as to detain people who clearly have not engaged in any act that can be considered terrorism according to international human rights standards. Because what we must remember is that our Prevention of Terrorism Act does not have a definition of terrorism. All the offences in the PTA are offences that already exist in either the penal code or in other laws. So terrorism actually can be interpreted in a very subjective way, not according to objective factors, which is why also it is very easy to abuse it. So I would say yes and no.
So why did the government, or you say now that the TID and the police usually use the Prevention of Terrorism Act to their advantage? If that case be the case in point that we're talking about, how important is it to repeal the PTA completely and bring in new amendments, or even have a progressive law in place of the PTA?
Well, I would say it is important to repeal it because if you look at the PTA, it does not create new offences, right? It only includes offences that are already in other laws. But what it does include are extensive powers given to the police, which they can use to abuse. So, for instance, it creates room for torture. Why? Because you can be held now after the amendment, up to 12 months in administrative detention, that is on a DO, which means you will be kept at the center in Tangala or you will be kept on the 4th floor at TID, and you will not be produced before a magistrate. The purpose of producing a person before a magistrate is to ensure that there is protection, that you will not be tortured. So that protection is not there. It says that a confession that is made to a police officer of the rank of ASP or above is admissible as evidence, which means most often you find the police don't even investigate the offense. What they do is they subject the person to torture, obtain the confession, and they file an indictment. I have seen many indictments filed only on the basis of torture. What this means is that the person who actually committed the offense might be going free. So what it does is, instead of preventing terrorism and protecting, it creates room for the violation of the human rights of, you know, the citizens.
Can you substantiate the claim that you just made now, saying that it's been used to torture individuals and not otherwise?
Absolutely. I can substantiate it because there are Supreme Court decisions that say that. I can substantiate it because the Human Rights Commission's National Study of Prisons, we found that over 90% of persons had been subjected to torture, and after they were tortured, they were asked to sign confessions that they had committed the offense. And of course, many of these, there have been cases where these indictments or the case was actually thrown out and the person was acquitted because the courts found that the confession was obtained through torture. So it's very obvious, it's recorded, it's out there in the public domain.
So, Ambika, you spoke about terrorism and you said that you can give different definitions to terrorism based on the PTA. Give me an exact definition for the word terrorism in a democratic framework in a republic like Sri Lanka.
Okay, so terrorism, even internationally, there isn't a firm definition as such, but there is a broad definition that is generally agreed upon. Now, this was put forward by the UN Special Rapporteur on protecting human rights while countering terrorism. So that has 3 elements to it. The first element is that it must result in death or grievous injury or hostage taking. That is the kind of offense that must be committed. The second thing is the purpose. The purpose for which it was the offense was committed would be to create fear, to force a government to do or not to do something. And the third element is that it must be within the framework set out by international conventions on terrorism. So any definition that even Sri Lanka comes up with in any new law would have to have not just one or the second one or the third one, but all 3 elements cumulatively.
Right. So on the 27th of January 2022, that's this year, Ambika, there was some progress made with regard to bringing in amendments to the Prevention of Terrorism Act. You mentioned about the 12 months being detained, a suspect being detained now. It was 18 months before. So do you think that we are in the right direction in terms of making progressive amendments to the Prevention of Terrorism Act?
Not really, because, okay, quickly, the positives of that was the 18 months was brought to 12 months. The other one was that bail can be granted in certain instances. The third one is that a magistrate, once a detention order is issued, the magistrate it has to be served on the magistrate within 48 hours, and the magistrate has to visit detained persons at least once a month. If the magistrate finds that there's been torture, has to refer the person to a judicial medical officer, should instruct the IGP to conduct an investigation into the torture, and has to transfer the person. Those are the positives, right? What are the still remaining negatives, the big ones? That you can still issue a DO for 12 months. That's a very long time and does not adhere to international human rights standards. The second one is confession.
No, I just want to interrupt you there for a second. So you say the 90 days detention DO that has now been signed against 3 individuals could be extended up to 12 months? Okay.
12 months, right? And
so that is with the president's signature?
President. So each time, the longest period for which you can issue a detention order is 3 months, and it should not exceed 12 months in total. That's what the law says.
Okay.
And the second thing is, of course, the confession. The confession is still admissible. The third thing is they have something called restriction order. So they can even issue a restriction order against me, tell me not to participate in events, tell me not to work with certain organizations. That still exists. And the sections which allow the Secretary of Defense, even after a person has been remanded to judicial custody, it allows the Secretary of Defense to determine where the person can be held. It allows Section 7, subsection 3, allows the police to take a person out of judicial custody to another place for inquiry. Now, we have documented when I was at the Human Rights Commission that egregious, serious instances of torture happened when people were taken out of prison, which is judicial custody, back again into this administrative detention. All those provisions, they still exist. So how can we say that we moved in the correct decision?
So, Ambika, earlier on, when I asked you a definition with regard to terrorism, you spoke about 3 points. You spoke about hostage taking. Let's take a look at the protests that took place recently in Sri Lanka. They almost took several government buildings hostage. Let me go on the other 2 points as well. Then the fear. We spoke about fear. There was fear amongst communities. At least politicians were scared to go to visit their homes. And then you spoke about international conventions being violated. But at least 2 of these points were questioned, don't you think, when it came to the aspect of terrorism as far as the PTA is concerned. And that is why probably, again, I'm playing the devil's advocate here because we don't have any government representative on the show tonight, that such an order was issued today.
Not really, because the first element, it says it has to cause death or grievous injury, right? And hostage taking. Now, that is taking hostage of human beings, not of buildings. And like death and grievous injury, so did Vasanta cause death or grievous injury? No, instead of which what we saw was that the police and STF, and there is plenty of video footage of this, brutally assaulting the protesters. So, I throw the question back to you as to who really should be, who engaged in terrorism here. And the second element that has to be there is that it has to create fear. And these people are protesting not to create fear, but to bring about a system change. So I would say no, not really.
Right. Thank you very much, the 3 of you, for your thoughts on the first round. I was just trying to give some direction to the show tonight. We are discussing on the topic, should the PTA be repealed and a more progressive law be enacted? Joining me this evening are 2 journalists. Onto my immediate right is Shehan Ranatunga, and onto my immediate left is the very vocal Faraz Shaukat. Faraz, with your permission, shall we start off with Shehan and then cross over to you?
Yes, please do. Thank you, gentlemen.
Because if you start talking, I won't be able to give Shehan an opportunity.
That's debatable, but let's go with that, shall we?
Yes, Shehan.
My first question is to Ms. Apkunnadan. We just spoke about, actually, we've taken into consideration all that's been discussed so far. Now, I would like to ask you, as a former Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, about the role of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. We know that a complaint has been lodged by the Indian University Students' Federation with regard to these 3 individuals who have been detained. Now, what can be done? What should be done by the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka in this regard? What can we expect?
Well, the Human Rights Commission Act says that when someone is arrested under the PTA, that the arrest has to be notified immediately to the Human Rights Commission. And actually, if they don't notify it, that itself is an offense. Now, this is according to the Human Rights Commission Act. When they amended the PTA earlier this year, this section was also included in the PTA amendment, right? So firstly, so that way you get to know who is being arrested. And along with the notification of arrest, they also need to send the detention order. So you have proof that that there is actually a detention order, and at least under the law, the person is being lawfully, quote unquote, lawfully detained. Then the other important role the Human Rights Commission has to play is visiting places of detention. The Human Rights Commission is placed in a unique position because it can visit any place of detention, any police center, station, any rehabilitation center, any detention center, Busa, Tangala, wherever, right? And it does not have to get anyone's permission. It does not have to inform anyone. And when it goes there, they do need to let you go. And you can also speak with the detained persons in private. They can't stand and listen to you. And so that is extremely important, because that is how you figure out whether torture has taken place or not. That is how you prevent torture from taking place. And if you find that someone has been tortured, the Human Rights Commission has the power to refer that person to a judicial medical officer, because a judicial medical officer is the person who records that the torture has happened, which you need even if you want to take legal action, like, for instance, file a fundamental rights petition. And of course, the Human Rights Commission, they have a hotline. So if someone is arrested and you don't know where the person is being held, you can call the hotline. They need to actually find out, and they need to let you know. And even where Vasante and the others were concerned, if they were detained for more than the 72 hours allowed under the law. So the Human Rights Commission has the authority to find out where they are, whether a DO has been issued, and if not, to insist that they issue the DO or to produce the person before a magistrate. So these are some of the things that the Human Rights Commission can do.
Dr. Saravanath, these are some serious charges. The bottom line here is they have been charged under the PTA. So the state believes that these are terrorists. What's your immediate concern where these three individuals are concerned, now that they have been detained?
Well, the immediate concern, as far as they are concerned, is that they are not tortured, that their human rights are protected to the extent that they can be, and that their safety and the sanctity of these people who are citizens of this country is respected. One can't hope for anything else,
Dr. Saran, interestingly, on the 15th of November 2018, there was a lot of damage to public property inside Parliament when the 52-day government was in play. There were several politicians who were involved in damaging public property at the Parliament premises, and we saw the manner in which how blows were dealt to the opposition as well as the government MPs who were in power at that time. This probably would be, don't you think, this probably would be a very good way for the president to prove that he is so concerned about public property and start looking at what happened on the 15th of November 2018, because even now we hear that Mervyn Silva, who went to the Rupavine Corporation 15 years ago, has been summoned to the CID. But don't you think if the president is very serious about those who are damaging public property, he probably could start off with what happened on the 15th of November 2018 in the Sri Lankan Parliament itself?
Yes, there have been a number of egregious incidents of violence, of misbehavior and misdemeanor and all of that, committed by a variety of people, from those who are members of Parliament to ordinary citizens. And the point here is this, is that we are talking about trying to get a society in which there is equality before the law, where the law is not applied differentially, differently to people because of the positions that they hold or because of the resources that they have, etc. Yes, of course, if the president, if the government is serious about restoring the rule of law in this country, they will look into all of these incidents.
But don't you think the president has a very big responsibility to play in the eyes of the international community, Dr. Sarah, because right now we are going with a begging bowl to almost all the countries for
The
help.
president has a responsibility as president of this country. So do the cabinet ministers, the legislature, the officers of government, and indeed we as citizens too. But yes, as the president of the country, as the head of the government, he has a special responsibility in this respect.
Why is it that the police went to the president to sign the 90 days detention order, Dr. Sarah, in your opinion? Because it was following a request made by the Sri Lankan police that the president had signed the DO to...
I understand that he's also the Minister of Defense and that it has to be signed by the Minister of Defense.
Yes. So the police had to file this request, and that is why the president or the Minister of Defense signs the document in question. So the president could say that he did so because the law enforcement authorities requested that these three people be arrested under the 90-day detention order as articulated in the Prevention of Terrorism Act.
I don't think that because the detention order is presented to the President or the Minister of Defense that he automatically has to sign it. There is a point in which, because he is putting his signature there, he is going to be responsible for that signature on that document. So he could well question it.
Tyagi, do you think human rights of the Sri Lankan citizens are now threatened under this new leadership?
I would say so, yes, especially because, I mean, this leadership has been, what, less than a month old now, right? It was 21st, I believe, when Ranil Wickremesinghe was sworn in as the president after he was elected by parliament. And since then, what have we seen? The very first 24 hours, we saw an immense crackdown on a peaceful protest site at Gotagogama on the 22nd of July. People were basically attacked, and there are allegations of torture as well. And this was done in the cover of the night at 2 a.m. when people had already said that they are hoping to move out. Was that necessary? And also, these are huge human rights violations. These are peaceful protesters who are outside the president's secretariat. And you're able, and you should be able, to stand outside any government building also and sort of say what you have to say. Your demands can be heard within sight and sound of your intended target, which is the government.
Tyagi, when you look at what happened on that day in question, can you define it as peaceful protesters taking center stage because they wanted the president out of the country, and that is why they took such decisions? Can you define it that way? Because if you look at what happened on that day itself, it was quite disastrous.
Are you talking about the 9th of July or the 22nd?
9th of July.
So 9th of July, right? Taking over a government building when
Two government buildings.
Actually three.
Three, yes.
And then an attempt at a fourth.
Yeah.
Actually, so that was with the intention of trying to further a demand, right? So it's different to somebody sort of trespassing with some other criminal intent, right? I agree. Every state has their own prerogative to deal with criminal instances according to the law of the country. But you have to also think of this in terms of acts of civil disobedience, right? They took over these government buildings, and actually, I don't know if you've seen, at the Presidential Secretariat, they took over the first room when you enter, and it was called the Library of Love. And that's stunning in a way, right? This is what the youth of this country wants for this country, for these government buildings to be accessible to people, for them to be a place where people can sort of go and come and borrow books. In a way, I don't know, there was something really fascinating about it. And yes, if that is against the law to take over the building like that, so if that's the case, why didn't the government just ask people to leave? People were coming in and out of these government buildings for weeks while the military and the police stood guard and watched them come and go. So why was it necessary to do this thing on the 22nd when they had already given an assurance that they were going to move out later that day, to kick these people out like this? It was absolute, it wasn't great.
Yes, Parag.
Yes, thank you, Shamim. Perhaps I could ask Dr. Saramuthu this question. Since they're arresting all these youth and so on, and so these three are being sort of done under the PTA, how come the police, in your view, are not arresting the people who first started the violence outside Temple Trees, you know, when they came out of Temple Trees and arrested these peaceful protesters? We don't hear that these people have been arrested.
Because the superiors have not given them the orders, and perhaps the superiors have been given orders by their political masters not to do that.
So this appears to be a sort of repetition of what happened during the Ayapalana government, when there was a committee around Temple Trees, which sort of almost, for want of a better word, cherry-picked the files that were sent to the FCID for investigation.
Quite possibly, yes.
And could I sort of ask Ms. Satgurunadan, do you think that the President is in control of these affairs?
Well, I cannot speculate on that, but also at the end of the day, the buck stops with him. So therefore, whether he's in control or not, he definitely is responsible, and we have to hold him accountable, particularly as the Minister of Defense, because under the PTA, it is the Minister of Defense who has the power. If you look at the Public Security Ordinance and declaring states of emergency and issuing emergency regulations, it is the President that has the authority. And after all, he is a President under the 20th Amendment with immense powers. So whether he's in control or not, he is the President, and he's responsible, and he's the person we have to hold accountable.
So, Ambika, just following up with the question with what Faraz asked Dr. Sara, we saw the first crackdown on protesters on the 9th of May, and we saw the manner in which how several ministers were involved in what happened on that day as well. But all these ministers are scot-free, and they were not held under detention orders for 90 days. They were not arrested and remanded. Several were, but not the entire gamut of individuals who were involved on the 9th of May protests and the meetings that preceded at the Temple Trees at that time. Why is that? What is the head of state trying to protect individuals and trying to show that this is what it means to have me as the president, and I will protect your interests?
It's not just Ranil Wickremesinghe. It is also, I mean, the political culture in Sri Lanka is that those in positions of power have always gotten away scot-free. They are not held to account, which is why impunity is so entrenched. And what is ridiculous about arresting someone for stealing a beer mug, or, you know, taking the president's flag, or sitting on the chair, is that you see the proponents of stability and people who are supporters of the president saying we are maintaining law and order. But it's actually making a mockery of the law, because when you do not hold people accountable for things like massive corruption, you know, bond scam, war crimes, violence against the protesters, and then you arrest and detain people for misdemeanors, for these minor offenses, what it shows is that you are abusing the law, and those who have power can escape accountability, and those who don't have power can't. Which means that in society, you create this culture or this contempt for the rule of law, and no one will take it seriously, because you're not applying the law equally or equitably.
So there's a question from one of our viewers on the number 0766 565353. The question is, isn't the government aware that they are just fanning the flames and antagonizing the population, which is simply detrimental for the government at this point of time, given the fact that issues of this nature are taking center stage in the public domain? Ambika?
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, because the thing is that we're using, they have not arrested people for really serious offenses, but clearly here they arrested someone who was involved in protests, organizing protests in France. And then when he visited his family in Nitambua, they arrested him, which means they are monitoring social media, they're keeping track of who's going in and out of the country, which also means they're expending a lot of public resources. At this point, during this economic crisis, is this how we want to use our public resources? Another example. Yes, a few days ago, right, when they had this protest and when Vasanta and the others were arrested, you saw the police had new uniforms. You saw that they had new riot gear. Where did all that come from? Where did the money come from? How much did they spend? And isn't that money that could have been better spent in, providing humanitarian assistance to the most poverty-stricken? So these are questions I think that citizens must ask, and that's a very pertinent question. Yes, it is detrimental on so many levels.
If someone was sitting in the panel today representing the government, they probably might ask you, Ambika, why can't the riot police have new gear? Why can't the riot police have new uniforms? Isn't that a part and parcel of ensuring that they are well protected in light of such protests that takes place in a country like Sri Lanka?
Well, the protest that day was peaceful, right? They were the ones who chased people. They are the ones who used water cannons. Witnesses on the ground, including reporters, say that these people were completely peaceful. They had no weapons. The police had batons. So who needs protection against whom? The citizens need protection against the police. And we are militarizing police. No, policing is about maintaining community peace. It is not about, viewing the citizen as an enemy, which is what it seems the Sri Lankan police are doing.
Dr. Sarab, interestingly, I don't think there has ever been an instance in the last 10 to 15 years in Sri Lanka, if there was, please enlighten me, that individuals have been arrested and DOs have been put in for 90 days under the Prevention of Terrorism Act for holding a protest. Has there been an instance in Sri Lanka during the last 10 to 15 years?
Not that I'm aware of for holding a protest, no. But I mean, there have been instances where people have been taken in for very flimsy reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, as far as I know, not for a protest.
Or for no reason.
Or for no reason.
No reason.
So,
absolutely. Yeah.
Dr. Sarab, isn't it interesting to see what is happening right now in Sri Lanka? Why? Because we thought, or we were of the opinion, that the Mahinda Rajapaksa administration would be very autocratic. If someone protested against the government, they would probably have a crackdown on them. There'll be tear gas, there'll be water cannons. But it has never gone to this level. There has been instances in which that the Ministry of Health at one point was stormed by protesters. Individuals were arrested based on that. Public property was damaged, but not under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. If so, why take this turn or this draconian law into play and arrest individuals of this sort? What is the mentality of the government?
Well, I mean, you refer to the Mahinda Rajapaksa regime and all of that. I mean, people will probably want to remind you about white vans.
Yeah.
So they didn't have to use the law. They used other means. But, what you're seeing is an accumulation, a gathering of the frustration, the anger, the disappointment, the distress of a population who feels totally cheated by who they elected. 6.9 million people, So that is what has now spread out into the streets and throughout the country, So we have to understand that what the Aragalaya was about is, at the end of the day, they focused on the Rajapaksas because they were the ones in power and they brought all of this to a sort of crescendo. But the Aragalaya came about not because the Rajapaksas created the problem alone, but because this was a problem within our system that has gathered steam to such a point that it spilled out into the streets. And yes, the laws that have been made in this country, some of them are fine, but they're never properly implemented. There are others that have been made purely for executive convenience and which are implemented also purely for executive convenience. So, we need to use this, therefore, as an opportunity to come up with a new social contract. There's no other word for it.
Dr. Sarab, a question from one of our viewers. Sri Lanka is in desperate need of true leadership and not a foolish dictatorship. The government seems to be afraid of a much stronger uprising, and they are trying everything to stop it before it starts. Isn't the government playing with fire?
It is. It is playing with fire. If you are trying to stamp out dissent in this country by ham-fisted, heavy-handed tactics, it's only going to rebound to your disadvantage, to your detriment. Look, as I said earlier, if things are going to get worse in terms of the privation and suffering that people are going to have to bear because of the economic burdens, you need a government not that is dividing people by using laws, etc., to stifle dissent, but a government that talks to them, who they trust, who communicates with them. It is about reconciliation and unity and all of that we needed because of the war, that we need now because of the crisis this country is in.
Right.
This is not the way to set about it.
Tyagi, I have a question for you from one of our viewers. They're sending me questions after questions, so I'm trying to take as many questions as possible, trying to give an opportunity for Faraz and Shehan also to pose questions, but I need to take some questions from our viewers as well. Considering the current human rights violations, what effect will these make on IMF plans to assist Sri Lanka? Can the public approach IMF to take this human rights violation seriously?
Absolutely, anyone can approach the IMF. Whether and to what extent they'll take that on board is, we're yet to see that. But of course, there are quite a lot of bilateral lenders who are waiting for the IMF, at least staff level agreement to be reached to provide funding through those institutions as well. So for them, even if the IMF isn't taking the human rights concern seriously, the bilateral lenders might. And all of this is happening, like we talked about earlier, just a few weeks before the Human Rights Council. On the 12th of September, there'll be a new resolution that will be discussed because the current one lapses at that time. And in this context, where there's so many human rights violations that are taking place, what's going to happen? That's probably going to be an even stronger resolution on Sri Lanka because of the government's treatment of people.
So 2 weeks from now, Sri Lanka would be again under the watch of the Human Rights Council sessions in Geneva. Do you think what happened today will be reflected on the High Commissioner's report?
I think it will be because they're going to probably release it in a few weeks. They'll probably send it to the government for their comments as well. And of course, because the mandate is to look at all human rights violations. So they're absolutely going to report on it. They would have been following it for a long time now.
What about trying to muscle their way through when it comes to these protesters, Tyagi? They're trying to prove a point. Don't mess with us. That's the strong point that they're trying to project. And there seems to be the notion of a self-imposed censorship taking center stage even now. We saw this during the war in Sri Lanka when the Mahinda Rajapaksa administration was in power. We saw trying to embrace the self-imposed censorship concept. Do you think that is happening even at this point of time?
Absolutely, right? Now, if you think back about how the PTA was used, you remember Thisanayagam. During the war, he was convicted under the PTA for an article he wrote. And then fast forward to the past few years, we've seen Hedras Hezbollah, we've seen poet Anaf Jazim, all of them being held for an inordinate amount of time under the PTA. And are these the people who have been behind the Easter bombings, for example? I don't think so. And I think the state also knows that. So what is the state trying to do now? Trying to go after the protesters with the PTA? It's a clear intimidation tactic. And that's something that's completely against what the Sri Lanka's international obligations are. We're a party to the ICCPR. There's a reasonable expectation for the government to respect, fulfill, protect the rights to freedom of expression, right to freedom of peaceful association and assembly. But what the government is doing is the complete opposite. And the IOSF has actually been talking about the fact that, and ironically, by the way, they were one of the groups that have been protesting against the PTA for a very long time. And now they're being targeted by it. And they predicted this would happen, especially when government ministers and the president himself, who, by the way, used the word terrorist in his policy statement on the 3rd of August 4 times, I believe. So they were setting the groundwork to go after protesters as terrorists using the PTA. The IUSF predicted that. And those predictions and concerns have materialized. And they know it's an intimidation tactic.
Tyagi, usually every year, Amnesty International puts out a report in question. The 2022 report is yet to be out, but I want to refer to the 2021 report, which was issued. And you'll speak about the freedom of expression, association, and assembly. You'll talk about rights to truth, justice, and reparation. You'll speak about arbitrary arrests and detentions under the PTA, because you all refer to the 2019 Easter Sunday bomb attacks as well, and you all say the man in which Hijaz Hezbollah was arrested under the PTA, and he was not being and poet Ansaf Jazim as well. You spoke about him before as well, and then you all speak in this particular reporting question about discrimination, excessive use of force and extrajudicial executions, gender-based discrimination and violence, and right to health as well. 2022 report, what will entail?
Good question. That's a long list of human rights violations you just read out. I would believe that on top of the arbitrary arrests that are happening, we would be very concerned about the white van type abductions that have been taking place. And
white van types of abductions taking place in Sri Lanka, because Dr. Sarah also mentioned this before. Now, are you referring to post Ranil Wickremesinghe presidency or pre-Ranil Wickremesinghe?
I'm talking about post, because
post Ranil Wickremesinghe presidency.
So Pushpika, for example, was pretty much dragged out of a bus by people in civilian clothing. They didn't disclose where he's being taken to. They didn't have an arrest warrant. Those are the usual safeguards that we talk about when people are conducting an arrest, for example. And then he was more or less missing for a couple of hours. And that's pretty much ticking off quite a few boxes of the elements that you'd have to complete to call it an enforced disappearance, right, except that he showed up a few hours later. But at least in that period, he was placed outside the protection of the law. And that's really concerning, right? Especially the fact that these abduction-style arrests were happening under the emergency regulations, but they weren't being charged under emergency regulations. They were releasing them after, because the offences were penal offences, so you produce them before a magistrate, they come out on bail. But was it really necessary to abduct people in this way? Wasn't it possible to arrest someone with an arrest warrant following due process if they've done any criminal wrongdoing and you have evidence of it?
Again, Tyagi, when you talk about white van style abductions, are you saying that there is a threat that under this new regime in power, that we will see such styled abductions taking place even in the future if no corrective actions are taken immediately?
We can only speculate at this point. And we can also ask the government to stop these arrests taking place in this way. It's really a chilling effect, especially because of the kind of history we've had. Yeah. Everyone would get terrified if you sort of go missing for a couple of hours, especially when the emergency regulations are in place, especially when the PTA could be used against, because this is how thousands of people have disappeared in the past.
Right. So I have a question for Ambika as well. First, do you have any questions? Can I take this question and
yes,
come back to you?
You do that.
Okay. Ambika, you were part of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka during the Yahapalana time. Am I correct? Right. So do you think that the HR Commission right now is doing enough in its capacity to tackle this issue? Is there more room to fight back? If so, what are the avenues and options available?
Well, first is that the Human Rights Commission for a very long time was not independent. It became independent legally after the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which was passed during Yahapalana. Then we have the 20th Amendment, and the 20th Amendment once again made the Human Rights Commission not independent because the appointments were in the hands of only one person, which is the president. So technically, legally, there is a problem there regarding independence. And in that sense, it does violate the Paris Principles, which all human rights commissions all over the world have to adhere to. In relation to how the Human Rights Commission is functioning, we have seen that even today they have issued a statement regarding the arbitrary arrests, the use of the PTA, and they've asked questions of the pertinent questions of the IGP. And of course, there were times when people were arrested, families, friends reached out to the Human Rights Commission and asked them to locate them. And what happened here was that, and this may be also, we come back to the independence issue here, because what we found, now Veranga Pushpika is a very good example because I am very aware of what happened there. From about the time he was arrested, which was during lunchtime, until around 9 p.m., so at least about 6-7 hours, we didn't know where he was. A complaint was made to the Human Rights Commission, and even the Human Rights Commission was given the wrong information by the police. The Human Rights Commission was treated in exactly the same disrespectful way that the lawyers were treated. The Human Rights Commission, like the lawyers and the family, went from, Paliagoda to Bambalapitiya, to fort, to Vallavatta, to fort again, right, for all these hours. So once again, this comes back to the question of independence, in that even if the Human Rights Commission functions or, independently, if the government disrespects them, does not respect the power they have, and also if the government does not take their recommendations seriously, then what impact can it have?
Ambika, because we cannot independently verify that the Human Rights Commission had gone to these locations in question, the three panelists need to take responsibility for the statements you all are making. So
absolutely.
I want to leave it at that. It's very important that, given the current context, it's very important to take responsibility for the statements you are making. So I want to, yes, Faraz?
Yes, indeed.
I have a quick question for Dr. Sarra, or do you want... Right, okay. Right.
Take a break. Have a cup of tea. No, listen, this question, could I pose this to Tyagi, please? Are you willing to concede that there may be some rationale in the authorities actually using this PTA to detain the 3 IUSF members? I'm asking this in a background where this has been used in the past, especially during the war and so on. And surely in a critical period like this, where we have the IMF discussions, we have this emergency, being declared and so on. Surely, are you willing to consider there may just be at least a small chance that this is actually justified?
Concede? Absolutely not.
Why are you so vocal about that?
Because the Prevention of Terrorism Act is supposed to target or act towards trying to prevent terrorism. This is not terrorism. Would anybody, I would challenge anyone in the audience to really say, is this what terrorism is?
Is there a possibility that the CID or the TID have information that is not ordinarily available to the public, and therefore they're asking for 90 days?
If that was the case, why haven't they come out with it already?
We really don't expect the investigative forces to disclose all the cards.
But aren't these penal offences, if at all, that has been committed? Have you seen any acts of terrorism happen in the past few months?
Well, the argument could be that when these protesters took over state property and so on, and went on a rampage of burning people's houses, although I understand that the 72 members of Parliament's homes, that they were treated under the normal law. There was no PTA involved in that investigation. So isn't there a possibility that, especially when the police are asking for 90 days, that they are already aware that they need this amount of time to do a comprehensive investigation?
Is it not possible to do the investigation after taking them in, letting them go on bail, and then if you have evidence that, could substantiate your allegations in front of a court of law, why can't you charge them at that point? At this point, all they're trying to do is send a message and to intimidate people.
But they didn't send that message with the people who burnt those houses.
Exactly. So now you can yourself see how selective they're using these laws against who are seen to be protest leaders.
Thank you.
Taking on that similar line of questioning, something you said earlier, Mr. Mapatrina, was you asked why didn't the government simply ask the protesters to leave? You were referring to the Library of Love. But the police had a media briefing soon after the crackdown on Gota Gogam, as it was formerly called, and they explained that we did repeatedly ask the protesters to leave, but they didn't. In fact, there was even an area which was restricted, where they told protesters, you must step outside this area, you cannot be within this area that's opposite the Presidential Secretariat main gate. So the police would argue that we did ask the protesters to leave, but they didn't, and so their justification was, we gave you warning, you didn't leave, and so we felt we had to take action. What do you say to that?
So when we talk about use of public property, right? So for example, opposite the Presidential Secretariat is the public road. Protest is a legitimate use of that public space as much as that road is used for public vehicular movement. That's pretty much the idea of using public spaces for protest. That's within your rights. Of course, you can't be violent about it. That is, of course, understood by international law as well. Protesters had already announced before the 22nd that they plan on giving back the buildings. They said this to the media, they had a press conference, and in that situation, was it necessary to attack them at 2 a.m.? I don't think so.
Dr. Sara, international efforts on right protection in Sri Lanka, do you think more can be done by the international community?
Well, I mean, international community, we can talk about sanctions, we can talk about all of those things. So yes, in the sense that, you think of what can be done, yes, those things could happen. But I suppose the international community's attitude towards Sri Lanka is the application of pressure and hopefully that the government would respond, and therefore they don't have to go to the extreme of imposing sanctions and all of that. But I mean, there have been times, I think, when the international community has been soft on the Sri Lankan government for reasons other than human rights. And I think that should be changed. I mean, you know, one would like to see international politics having human rights integrated well into it, and it's not a sort of, you know, opportunity cost of doing one thing and not the other kind of thing. But yes, I think, yeah, the international community can do more.
When you say sanctions, Dr. Sarab, I recollect post-war Sri Lanka, there were a lot of discussions about bringing forth sanctions against Sri Lanka as well with regard to human rights violations during the latter stages of the conflict. But it did not materialize. But even now you speak about sanctions and how important it is to keep the government in watch. Do you think even the UN system allows sanctions to be imposed on a country?
I think the
just
reason,
because of violations of this sort?
No. I mean, the point here is this: is that I think why there has been an inhibition on the part of the international community with regard to sanctions, etc., is that you do not want to penalize an entire population for something that their government has done or members of their government have done. So we talk, therefore, about targeted sanctions. And those can be applied to many more people who have been involved in the government of Sri Lanka, who have allegations of very serious crimes, misdemeanors, etc. You know, so it doesn't have to be sanctions against the country. And, you know, one of the ways in which the whole UN human rights sessions, etc., are played out in Sri Lanka is to talk about a resolution against Sri Lanka. It's as if the whole country or the entirety of the armed forces are being put in the dock.
But in 2015, that was corrected by Mangala Samaraweera in his capacity as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, right?
Exactly, but you still have that sort of notion that there is going to be a resolution against Sri Lanka. No, I mean, what we are talking about here is actions of governments. And therefore, you can talk about selected sanctions. I mean, we have travel bans on particular individuals who are still in government, you know, or as a consequence of what they have done or alleged to have done in terms of the war.
Yeah, Dr. I just want to understand, when you speak about the UN resolution itself, we saw the manner in which how the then government from 2009 to 2015 took a very strong stand against the UN as well when it came to the resolution in question. In 2015, when the Yahapalne government was elected, I recollect that Mangala Samaraweera went on to the UN sessions and said that they want to support the resolution in question. And that's how co-sponsor the resolution in question. And then we saw a few years ago, Minister Dinesh Gunawardena said that they want to come out of that resolution, co-sponsorship, and they want to have a different approach to the resolution in question. Now we have a new president, Ranil Wickremesinghe. We now have a new Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister Ali Sabri. What would the agenda be now, the foreign policy with regard to the resolution?
Well, I'd like to think that the government of Sri Lanka will not oppose and actively canvass countries to vote against the passage of the new resolution. But the government of Sri Lanka would obviously want to see certain things either in or out of that resolution. So short of co-sponsoring and short of saying we oppose the idea of a resolution on Sri Lanka, the government will try to influence that resolution.
Right. Do you think the sessions that are taking place in 2 weeks from now would at least give the government a heads up as to what to expect in the next few years as far as the international community is concerned, because the government seems to not really care as to what happened at the UN sessions over the years. Would that be the same attitude now?
The new resolution would presumably embody some sort of international consensus as to what is the situation in Sri Lanka and what needs to be done in terms of remedying it or improving it. So in that respect, yes, the resolution will provide a reference point as far as the human rights situation in the country is concerned and what the international community thinks about it.
But can the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights take stringent actions against countries?
No,
has it happened before?
The only UN body that can mandate its member states to take action against another member state is the Security Council.
But Sri Lanka has the support of
Sri Lanka
Russia
has
and China.
not got on the agenda of the Security Council because we'll always come up against Chinese and Russian veto. So no, the Human Rights Council can't come out and sort of say do this or do that or whatever, and states have to obey. That's not the case. That's not how the UN system works.
So does the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights have any teeth? They discuss about all this. This has been discussed for the last 12 years, Dr. Sarah. It has been discussed over and over again. But the government in power has not taken them seriously at all. They can they've always been with the attitude, we'll do without it.
The UN Human Rights Council is the only multilateral forum in which Sri Lanka is discussed. Since 2012, actually 2009 when the first resolution was passed, since 2012 we've had resolutions on Sri Lanka, we've had the Office of the High Commissioner come out with a report on Sri Lanka. We now have something called the Accountability Project within the Office of the High Commissioner. The Foreign Minister of Sri Lanka went and said we are going to establish 4 mechanisms for reconciliation. So we've had certain things happen because there is a Human Rights Council at which sessions Sri Lanka comes up. So call it moral pressure, and maybe moral pressure is not as effective in the short term as physical pressure or whatever, but it is making a difference.
But they have thick skin, Dr. Sarah.
Yes, they have thick skin, and because you had regimes which had even a thicker skin and have taken the sense of shame out of our public life, we've had to deal with the crisis that we have now. But incrementally at least, if you take away the UN Human Rights Council, if you take away the United Nations, you'd have to invent it. Because there is something called a moral force in international politics, even if it doesn't have the paramountcy that one would like it to have.
Now, Ambika, do you agree with Dr. Sarah's thoughts about the international community having a moral policy with regard to an obligation as far as...
A moral force, I would
say. Moral force.
Well, the international community, I suppose, has a duty, definitely. And countries like Sri Lanka, and not just Sri Lanka, I mean, many countries, they pull the sovereignty card and say that because of sovereignty, you can't interfere, etc. But I think there is that moral duty of on the community of nations to hold others accountable, whoever it is, whether it's United States or United Kingdom or Sri Lanka, right? And I think the importance of the UN Human Rights Council is documentation. The fact that this goes on record, the fact that, in March and in September that this comes up, that people are reminded of this, that the High Commissioner records it. Now, the High Commissioner is different to the Council. The Council has elected members, 47. They are in rotation, on rotation. The High Commissioner's office is the secretariat, in a sense, to the Council. And the High Commissioner prepares a report and she presents it to the Council. September is very important because in September, the High Commissioner in her report is going to put forward suggestions as to what needs to be done regarding accountability. She has to put forward suggestions. So to hold people accountable, trials, prosecutions, that is very important. So I think we need to wait and see what the suggestions are. Right now, what can be done generally where accountability is concerned, universal jurisdiction. You talked about the international community. Any country, well, most countries, there are certain offenses or crimes that, even if they're committed in Sri Lanka, if the perpetrator happens to be in another country, they can actually take action to prosecute. We see Syrians being prosecuted. This is happening in Germany. We see Iraqis, Syrians being prosecuted for even crimes they committed 10, 12 years ago in countries like Germany, in countries like Sweden. Even over the last 24 months in particular, there have been quite a few cases. So the international community can also do that.
Are you trying to say that in the event the international community finds a former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa guilty of war crimes as suggested post-2009, that action could be taken against such an individual?
So now, let's say, a person who is accused of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity happens to be in a country like Sweden, and there are victims who happen to be in Sweden, and the Swedish prosecutor has evidence of this, and they have been working on this for a long time. They get news that this perpetrator is coming into the country. Yes, they can arrest the person and they can prosecute them, which is what was happening to all the people I mentioned before, the Syrian, the Iraqi, etc. And yeah, that can happen, and that is also probably why the former president doesn't have many countries in which to seek refuge because of universal jurisdiction.
Can I put this to you, Ms. Sakunanathan? In 2015, there was sort of great joy that the Rajapaksa presidency had finished, and there was this sort of new hope. A member of the International Democrat Union was the Prime Minister, and everything seemed ever so wonderful. But isn't it, despite all that, isn't all this business about the chances of reconciliation, accountability, responsibility, and all that on the part of Sri Lanka, notwithstanding this international moral compass and all that business, isn't the real issue here that the government in Sri Lanka has carried out possibly the greatest ever fudge when it comes to addressing these issues? Absolutely.
And I think even the Yahapalana government was better than most governments. And in that they, particularly Minister Mangala Samaravira did make an effort. But the fact is, the general fear, I think, was there, particularly in relation to truth and accountability, particularly accountability, prosecutions, because the fear was that these people are war heroes. If we prosecute them, there might be a backlash, an uproar, there might be an impact on our next electoral, our chances at the next election. So there was that fear, which is also why they faltered, they delayed, and the more they delayed, the opposition at the time gained strength. And they also, the Yahapalana government was terrible at PR. They really did not know how to counter the sovereignty argument and the traitor argument, the usual tropes that the opposition, the Rajapaksas at the time, were putting forward.
But when we look at the Aragale and these peaceful protests that we were treated to here in Colombo and maybe a little bit outside, but the situation up in the north was quite different. Are you saying that those people were so well off that they had no need to protest like their southern brothers and sisters?
To the contrary, their entire life is a protest. Their existence is the Aragalaya. So every day they protest. And for instance, the families of the disappeared have been protesting for 2,000 days non-stop, despite intimidation, harassment, threats, surveillance. Many of them are from, poverty-stricken families, so socioeconomic problems, family pressures, despite they have been. But why do people in the South not know about it? Because the Southern media does not give visibility, because they are protesting disappearances, because they are Tamils. It is not deemed as important. It doesn't get visibility. In the North and the East, the military, even now in the middle of the economic crisis, has been trying to take over land, has been trying to acquire land, right? And the people from those communities, they protest. They protest all the time. But you don't see that here. People don't know about it. So I would say for them, every day is an Aragalia. Every day is a protest.
Thank you, but one item there. I think when you said about the Southern media, I trust that you've left News First out of this, out of that, because News First is very proud to be people-centric, people first at our channel.
Would you?
What percentage of your coverage of the Aragale would you have given to the North and
East? Now,
I'm sure that our channel, I must admit to not watching Shakti, because I don't
well,
speak
Shakti
the language.
Shakti does cover.
Absolutely.
Shakti does.
So,
what I meant for us was also not Shakti covers, but once again, it's the Tamil people who are watching it. They already know it because they are reading the Tamil newspapers. They are on Tamil Facebook, community, etc. What I meant is for the Sinhala people that they need to know.
Right.
Thank you.
Tyagi, in 2022, the UN experts set out 5 benchmarks as far as the PTA is concerned, and they say that these reforms are necessary prerequisites to making the law compliant with international law. They speak about employing definitions of terrorism consistent with international norms, ensuring legal certainty, especially when it comes to impact rights to freedom of expression, opinion, association, and religion or belief, including provisions to prevent and halt arbitrary deprivation of liberty, including provisions to prevent torture and enforce disappearance, guaranteeing due process and fair trials, including judicial oversight and access to legal counsel. Do you think the 3 individuals who were arrested under the detention orders of 90 days under the Prevention of Terrorism Act would get all these benefits in terms of making sure that their rights are protected?
Absolutely not, because for starters, even the PTA, which we consider a draconian law, right, which is not in line with international human rights standards, even this law says that you need to produce somebody who was arrested under the suspicion of a PTA offense. They have to produce them before a magistrate within 72 hours. If I'm not mistaken, Vasantha Mudalige was arrested at 4:20 p.m. on Thursday. He wasn't produced before a magistrate and still hasn't been produced before a magistrate well beyond that 72-hour period. And it was only after that that a detention order was produced. So that means that they can hold him for 90 days without producing him before a judge. That's atrocious. And all these, the elements you read out that need to be worked on in the anti-terror law of this country haven't been worked on, which is why activists and civil society have been calling for PTA to be repealed wholesale for a very long time.
So you spoke about the 72-hour window with regard to these individuals in concern. So are you trying to tell me that the 72 hours window lapsed and the government issued the detention order subsequently and they had the right for a counsel at that time?
Right to legal counsel,
legal counsel, yeah.
Legal counsel should have been given at the point, from the point he was arrested. I'm not sure if he's been allowed access to a counsel, but definitely there was no detention order that was produced and given to him or his lawyers till today, for example. So that is well beyond the 72 hours, which is not okay by international standards, but it's also not okay by Sri Lanka's draconian law standards.
Right. I want to pick the brain of all three panelists with regard to the current state of affairs in Sri Lanka, because right now we seem to be in a dilemma. We are, as I said before, we are going with a begging bowl to the international community. We saw the manner in which even recently Minister Ali Sabri's visit overseas, he presses the international community for help. He urges the international community to assist Sri Lanka. We saw the manner in which when he spoke to the diplomats, foreign diplomats, with regard to the sessions that are coming up at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva 2 weeks from now, he speaks about the importance of reforming the Prevention of Terrorism Act as well. In your opinion, what must the government do now? Now we know this has happened, but we have a black mark right now. What must we do? Let's start off with Tyagi.
I would say they did not one good thing. So basically allowing the emergency regulations, which shouldn't have been issued in the first place, to lapse last week was a good thing. But they shouldn't have started using the PTA instead. There was an unofficial moratorium. I believe that's what the international community was told by government. That should have been maintained at least until the act was replaced with something. I would think that the government needs to be making the right gestures and telling the human rights community and the international community that it's serious about the rights of the people. These people have come to the streets because of very legitimate economic reasons. They haven't had gas, they haven't had diesel, they haven't had fuel, they haven't had like a lot of things.
Kerosene prices shot up drastically today.
People don't have medicine. People are going to suffer with a food crisis. These are legitimate reasons why people have been out on the streets. To ignore that is a crime for our people. And right now we should be making the right signals, doing the right things, showing the international community that we're taking this seriously. But instead, we seem to be doing the wrong things.
Dr. Sarah?
Well, yes, I mean, I agree with what Tyagi has said. I mean, we have certain commitments that we have made and have come as a consequence of the resolutions that we should fulfill. I mean, the PTA is an egregious one. We have to get rid of it. We have to fulfill our obligation to get rid of it, repeal it, and replace it with one consonant with international human rights standards. We have the whole questions of what have we done with regard to accountability? We have done zero. We went in 2015 and said we were going to establish 4 mechanisms for reconciliation. We've established 2. They've had a checkered histories, I guess. What about the other 2? Nothing has happened. And especially as far as accountability has been concerned, I was the secretary of a consultative task force that went around this country explaining to people and asking them what their views were on the 4 mechanisms that were identified by Mangala Samaraweera at Geneva. And they did come back and say to us, look, yes, we agree. We want a foreign judge on every panel of accountability. And our recommendation was that, look, yeah, we should do that because there is no faith and trust in the judicial system in Sri Lanka. Otherwise, we won't be talking about these things. Once that's established, this can be phased out. But the government said we had no right to say anything like that. And people got up and said, oh, we didn't sign the Rome Statute, we can't go to the ICC, we can't turn war heroes into war criminals, and all of that, and the whole thing collapsed. So we have outstanding obligations which we can fulfill.
Amika?
I think it's yes, while we have international obligations because we've signed treaties, and of course there is a Human Rights Council resolution, but I think going beyond that, these are things that we need to do because it's just good for our country.
Exactly.
Protecting the rights of our citizens is good for our country. And if we're talking about, holding people accountable, I think we also need system change. So for instance, people wanted a foreign judge. They wanted foreign judges to be part of the court. But what I always say is having foreign judges is not going to fix anything. because the people who investigate the cases will be the police from the same police department. The people who prosecute and file the charges will be from the AG's department, which is not independent because it functions both as public prosecutor as well as advisor to the government. There is a conflict of interest there. And there have been instances in the past where they've even represented police officers who were accused of torture. That has happened in the past. So therefore, we do need a system change and also a change in our political culture and how we view accountability if we want, if we want change. So it's kind of a wholesale overhaul.
But yeah,
Ms. Satgunathan, if you just picking up something you just said, you spoke about what's good for our country. I just want to bring a different perspective here. There is a large part of society who are looking at the situation right now. And as we've already raised, now we know very well there's Sri Lanka is going through a serious crisis. In fact, the latest assessment by the World Bank shows that we are number 5 in the countries with the highest food inflation. And we're in this situation. And there are some who say, looking at this change in government, now we have petrol, now we have diesel, now we have gas. And the same people would turn out and say, enough with the protests, enough with this chaos. Let's bring stability back into the picture. And they say, we need to get back to work. This creates a negative image of Sri Lanka to the world. What do you say to those people?
I would say absolutely, let's bring stability back. But how do you bring stability? How did we get here? Because we have petrol and gas now, but we still have a foreign exchange crisis. We still have unsustainable debt. Even if the IMF package comes through, there's a lot of reform that we must do. And the reason we got to this is because we had this attitude that we refuse to see the systemic problem. We had a very overpowerful executive. We never held our elected representatives accountable. They could make decisions like populist tax cuts, disastrous decisions regarding the fertilizer. They could lie to the public about even the foreign exchange reserves. So that is the problem, and that problem has not been solved. So we might have gas and electricity and fuel now, but in a few months' time, unless we address these root causes, we're going to be back at square one. I think that is what people need to realize.
Yeah,
I'd like to get Dr. Saramantu's opinion on this as well. To those who say that we need to provide oxygen to Sri Lanka, it's dying. So let's focus more on, there are some good things happening now. If there is some violence that needs to be rooted out, so be it. But let's get the country back running.
I mean, if the Aragale has done something, it has said that, look, we needed regime change because regime change was going to facilitate systemic change. So this is a unique opportunity that this country has to get things right or put things on the right trajectory. If we miss it, then we are going to have to pay the consequences,
So Dr. Sar, we have a question for you from one of our viewers. What is your analysis on the current behavior of the opposition? Are they doing enough to support the people's struggle?
Well, the opposition is in a curious position, and if the opposition here, I mean the SJB in particular, because the SJB has said that they will support the government on the economy. However, they have said that they want the abolition of the executive presidency. They want a general election. So they're going to support the government on the economy, but at the same time they want a general election and all of that. How do you square the two? And so I think the SJB has to come out very definitely and say, look, yes, we are going to support the government on the economy because that is the most important thing, but we want the government to come up with a particular plan or guideline or whatever, and that's what we're going to push them for. A guideline with regard to, are they going to abolish the executive presidency or not? And more importantly, I suppose, when are we going to have the next general election? You know? So, in a sense, Mr. Premadasa, by saying that he will not work with President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, that he wants to see an abolition of the executive presidency and he wants an election, he can claim to say that he has stood on principle and that he has not compromised with regard to it. But at the same time, it's contextual as well. I mean, there might be SJB supporters who feel that he hasn't seized the moment. And he has given Mr. Wickremesinghe now a chance to revive and resuscitate the fortunes of the United National Party. On the other hand, if Mr. Wickremesinghe fails on the economic front, then that would be a failure as well for the United National Party. But yes, I mean, the opposition is, because of the dire nature of the economic crisis, they don't want to be seen to be campaigning against the government or wanting to, or seen to be contributing to political instability and turmoil. But at the same time, they know very well that you have to get the politics right if you are going to get the economics right thereafter.
Dr. Sarab, we've seen in Sri Lanka political parties, especially during the last 10 to 15 years, using baits when there's a bigger problem prevailing in the country, issues which are not supposed to be in the public domain or should not be taken much attention, they come into the surface. Right now, Sri Lanka is facing a very dire economic constraints. It's a problematic situation right now. As Shehan mentioned, 20 liters of petrol a week is definitely not enough. But at least the government seems to be on the right direction. So you give the benefit of the doubt to the government and say, at least they're doing enough. And now, all attention is being focused on the Prevention of Terrorism Act and not the country's economy. Everyone seems to be talking about this. Don't you think this seems to be another bait of a well-experienced politicians in the caliber of Ranil Wickremesinghe to deviate from the real problem that we are facing at the moment?
Well, one hopes not, because that would be perpetuating a political culture that has got us to this point. You know, and that is why civil society, the Aragale, whoever, have to keep putting on the pressure to say that we have a multifaceted crisis of governance. We have to be able to work on all of these fronts. We can't single out one particular aspect of it and focus only on that and expect the rest to fall into place. That's just not going to happen. You know, so we have to move in an integrated fashion.
Tyagi, I just want to drag your attention back to the 88-89 JVP insurrection and what is happening right now. Do you see any similarities with that, with what is happening right now in Sri Lanka? Even at that point, there was a lot of discussions about the Batalanda detention center, and the political authority at that time who handled the Batalanda detention center was the current president of the country, Ranil Wickremesinghe. Do you see any similarities?
There are absolutely similarities in the crackdown and the manner in which the state has gone after people who've been dissenting. The difference is that there was an armed insurrection then. This was largely peaceful protests. The kind of violations and violence we saw from the state side, where there were extrajudicial executions and things like that, we hope aren't happening now, and which brings me to the point about these unexplained bodies washing up. We've seen what I would say at least 5 to 10 instances of bodies mysteriously washing up, and we've not seen postmortems made public about what the cause of the deaths were. So it's somewhat, it could be a Richard D'Souza situation, it could be protesters, but are they people who've tried to leave the country and the boat has capsized? Are they drug-related executions? We just don't know. But it is causing fear amongst the people because it harks back to the 80s.
And that could be detrimental to the country as well in the long run.
Absolutely.
And people are going to remember 2022 for the wrong reasons, isn't it? Tyagi?
Yes.
All right. I want to move my attention to Ambika now. Ambika, interestingly, you've always spoken about the repealing of the PTA. This has to be replaced with a more progressive law and so on and so forth. What is your suggestion? You know Sri Lanka in and out now. You've worked with international bodies. You've worked with the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. What is the need of the hour right now?
Do you mean in relation to the PTA or do you mean generally?
Generally. What is the need of the hour right now?
Oh, goodness. Right. I think the need of the hour is to have...
We're just 2 weeks away from the UN Human Rights Council sessions. In that context, I'm posing this question to you.
Well, I think what we need is a government that the people trust. We need a government that respects the rule of law. We need a government that does not abuse the law for its own self-serving purposes. We need a government that does not violate human rights, and a government that does not waste its time and public resources engaging in a witch hunt against people who have been peacefully protesting and dissenting, only to create a climate of fear so that they can continue, with business as usual. I think that those are the basic things. We can go into details, but generally speaking, that is what we need, and that is what we do not have now, because the government is doing the very opposite of every single thing I've said.
In terms of the PTA, what must we do?
In terms of the PTA, we definitely must repeal it, because what it has shown is that it does not keep the country safe, and it does not hold accountable the people who actually commit these offences. What it does is it just creates room for abuse and for violations of human rights. And if the government does want to have, legislation regarding national security, it needs to consult people who have the expertise and who view this within a human rights lens, like, for instance, the UN Special Rapporteur on protecting human rights while countering terrorism.
Ambika, the International Monetary Fund plays a big role right now in Sri Lanka, because we are now discussing about a standby arrangement. We're discussing about the IMF coming into Sri Lanka's help, and we all know that the US plays a very critical role as far as the IMF is concerned. However, today the US ambassador to Sri Lanka issuing a tweet says that using laws that don't conform with international human rights standards like the PTA erodes democracy in Sri Lanka. The US encouraged the government to uphold the rights of the people to express their views. Now, these are very strong statement. And then we have a statement from the EU as well, which talks about the importance of repealing the PTA. They say that it is concerned about reports on the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act in recent arrests. The EU delegation in Sri Lanka says it refers to information given by the government of Sri Lanka to the international community about the de facto moratorium of the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Very, very strong statements. Do you think that the IMF may even reconsider, because we know a few days from now the IMF is due in Sri Lanka on the 24th to the 29th. Do you think that they might even consider assisting Sri Lanka when the country's human rights record is very, very bad or poor?
Well, the reality is that the IMF, not the UN, sorry, maybe Freudian slip, the IMF has not historically concerned itself with human rights issues. That's just a fact. But the human rights issues are also related to governance issues, and the IMF is concerned about that because governance has a huge impact on how the economy is run. It is because of dysfunctionalities in our governance, lack of accountability, the all-powerful executive president, that we also are in the current crisis. So in that sense, governance matters, transparency matters, anti-corruption issues matter, and accountability matters to the IMF. Now, for example, one of the issues related to human rights is militarization. Now, the IMF will definitely speak about cuts in public funding. So I would say we need to look at the military when we talk about cuts to public funding, because even in the interim budget that was presented just last week, there has been an increase in military spending. Why on earth? If you look at the reports of the Auditor General, that just even for the last 3 years of the Triforces, the Army, Navy and the Air Force, you would see that there are cases of financial wastage, massive financial, mismanagement, possible corruption, but these reports were never even debated in Parliament. Why? So that is how you would also work within the IMF framework to make the connections between what the IMF is concerned about and what we are talking about, because it's all connected.
With regard to de-radicalization regulations issued under the PTA, what are your views on this?
Well, those were issued, when was it? I think it was last year. Time is now relative. Yes, last year. And they were, well, once again, they did not adhere to human rights standards because they had vague offenses. They seemed to target the Muslim community. It was an arrest first, investigate later situation there. It gave the president power to appoint anyone or empower anyone to arrest a person. A person could be sent for up to 2 years for this rehabilitation, which was actually arbitrary detention, without even a trial. The Attorney General had to, decide the person needed to go to rehabilitation. Then the person was presented before a judge, but the judge acted only as a rubber stamp. And thereafter, the person's detention or rehabilitation could be extended by the Minister of Defense. So it did not adhere to basic human rights standards. Of course, there were many fundamental rights petitions filed against it. I filed one, CPA filed another, and that is currently in the Supreme Court.
What are your thoughts on this, Dr. Sarab?
No, I agree with
entirely
what Ambika has said. I mean, you give it to sort of executive discretion to decide as to who needs rehabilitation or not. And what is this rehabilitation we're talking about? It is, again, absolutely farcical. It is meant as an instrument of control, an instrument of intimidation. It should not be there. It goes against the fundamental rights chapters in our Constitution.
Tyagi, what is the role of a president in a democracy, in your opinion?
Yeah, it would have to be my opinion because Amnesty doesn't take a stance on democracy, actually. I would think protecting the rights of the people should be a primary goal or primary duty of a president. Because, something Sarah said earlier about, how these Human Rights Council resolutions are seen as anti-Sri Lanka or against Sri Lanka. At the end of the day, if there's a resolution in Geneva that other states, member states of the Human Rights Council are voting on to protect the rights of the people of Sri Lanka, isn't that a good thing for us? That should be what the government's agenda, government's role, government's, the executive president should be doing.
Tyagi, now, we all saw what happened or transpired between April and July in Sri Lanka. We saw protests taking place. We saw the Aragalaya taking center stage. We saw the manner in which how a president fled the country who cannot or could not control what seemed to be something that could have been easily controlled by the executive at that time. And then we had a acting president, and that acting president, fortunately or unfortunately, for sheer luck, not even having a parliamentary seat, became the president of the country. And now he is calling the shots. Is he trying to prove a point now to the Rajapaksa family as to this is how you should manage a conflict, and now he has the power? Now, is he trying to prove a point? In every sense, may it be economics, may it be the way he's handling the protests, maybe how he handled the Aragalaya, because initially when he was appointed, he in fact said, I want to support the Aragalaya. I'm here to support them. He in fact appointed Ruwan Vijayawardena to go and have discussions with the members of the Aragalaya as well. Isn't he trying to prove a point? I am at the helm now. Listen to me.
Yes and no, because it's not that a regime that was run by the Rajapakshas didn't know what, control was like, or using the military or the police in a brutal manner. Those are all things that we've seen over the past 2 decades, I would say. So that's not something new to the Rajapakshas. Was it necessary? I believe there's an interview done with former Prime Minister and former President Mahinda Rajapaksa over the weekend, where he had said that, yes, to fix the economy, you needed Ranil Wickremesinghe, and that's why he supported his candidacy as a president when it came up for election last month.
No, but he said that he supported Dalla Salab Peruma when he was walking out of Parliament on that day.
I would suggest, reading the Sunday Times political column this weekend, I would say that he's saying 2 things in that sense. But at the end of the day,
but double standards, that's part and parcel of politics, Natyagi. You say one thing now, then you say this something else later, and then they say no enemies and friends in politics.
But isn't that why Aragalaya has come about in the first place? That, people have got fed up of this political culture about the duplicity, about the lying, taking the electorate for a joke. That's why people are calling for system change.
Now, we had the Minister of Justice on the show several weeks ago, and he said his timeline to implement the 22nd Amendment of the Constitution was 6 weeks. Now it's nearly 3 months, and nothing concrete has taken place yet on the 22nd Amendment of the Constitution. So let's say we are talking about a more progressive law to replace the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Do you think that will happen quickly, haphazardly, just like that?
I guess it also depends on how much pressure there is on him, internationally as well as domestically. And I believe even before he was sworn president, there's been a huge campaign locally asking for the PTA to be repealed. Those are conditions that the opposition parties, all of them, can put to the government and ask, if we are to form an all-party government, what are your views going to be on the executive presidency? What are your views going to be about the PTA? What are your views going to be about all the kind of changes and the change that the Aragalaya has been asking for? So maybe that's something that...
But do they even care now about what the Aragalaya people were talking about and what they were envisaging for Sri Lanka, the systematic change, system change? Do they even care? Now they're in power. They can do whatever they want. 2 years from now, 2.5 years from now, is a time for a presidential election and a parliamentary election by the end of next year. So they seem to be on the right track. It's ultimately the people who have faced the brunt, isn't it?
I think it would be a mistake to not think that this political crisis and the economic crisis, that they're not linked. What Ambika mentioned earlier about the fact that we need to address the root causes. Why did we come to this position in the first place? We put so much power in the office of the president. He could make a lot of decisions without the necessary checks and balances, without independent institutions being able to perform that job. That's what got us here in the first place. So if you're not going to fix those problems, it could very well be the case that 2 months down the line, we'll be in the same situation we were in a few months ago, a few weeks ago. It's a vicious cycle that needs to be broken. And so I suppose that question is better posed to the president himself.
But do you think that with what is taking place right now, people would even dare to go to the streets and protest?
I'm not sure. We'll have to wait and see. But I think the more you suppress people, the more you repress their rights, the stronger it's going to come out in different ways.
Right. One final question before I go for a short commercial break, and then do you have any questions?
Yes,
okay.
Actually, you touched on suppression. Since the police, they continue to carry out arrests. In fact, if I could just direct this question to Dr. Saranamuthu, police in a statement said that so far 3,553 suspects have been arrested and 1,255 have been remanded. This is over investigations over the violence or the incidents that transpired on the 9th of May. That's a lot of people who have been arrested, and people are afraid. The people will be wondering tomorrow, who's next? You know, some people are even afraid. You know, they think back, oh no, what did I share on social media? Maybe I accidentally liked something. About this fear psychosis that's right now in the minds of the public. What do you have to say, Doctor, about this?
No, I mean, you know, that we have a fear psychosis in the minds of the public at a time when this country is in dire crisis as far as the economy is concerned. And the whole thing is to bring people together to face this crisis, to surmount the challenges that face us, is a terrible indictment on the system of governance that we have. It should be entirely different. We should be coming together now, rather than living in fear of thinking about what we said or did or didn't do 2 months ago, and, you know, wondering whether we're going to be picked up or not. This is exactly what we should not be having. We should be coming together, you know. So, you know, people who believe that you can govern a country in a thrall of fear and terror always have to recognize at some point it's going to snap and it's going to come back and hit them. You know, if you look at Sri Lanka, every 20 or so odd years, we have, I mean, it sounds dramatic, but we have cleansed with blood. And what have we cleansed? We've cleansed our youth. You know, are we going to continue this? Haven't we learnt enough? Haven't we learnt enough? Surely there must be someone within that political establishment who has the guts, who has the imagination, the courage to come out and say, look, enough is enough. We now have the opportunity to come up with a different vision for our country. You know, a country which is founded at the end of the day on unity in diversity. All the peoples of Sri Lanka have to get together and work for collective prosperity and individual freedoms.
Dr. Sara, what takes me back is 2016 in Turkey, when there was a coup. The president of Turkey arrested approximately around 2,839 soldiers, dismissed approximately 2,745 Turkish judges. Mass arrests took place in 2016 in Turkey. Do you think that is where we are heading as a nation right now? Those who were involved in the Aragalaya are being arrested. Those who stood for a cause to make sure that Sri Lanka came out of that political crisis that we faced. Yes, Doctor.
I do not agree with what happened in Turkey,
Yeah.
but to equate that coup, attempted coup, with the Aragalaya is somewhat facile, I think, because the Aragalaya was not armed. Did it ever come to the point at which it was going to take over the state? No, it did not. What it wanted was system change. You know, and so, you know, we can look around the world and talk about superficial, you know, similarities within with what happened in this country and that country and all of that. But we must understand what happened here. And what happened here is that we got a mass uprising saying regime change in order to facilitate system change. And that we must not lose sight of.
Right. Faraz, do you have any questions or? Right, so we're going for a short commercial break. This is Face the Nation. We are talking on the topic, should the PTA be repealed and a more progressive law be enacted? We are in conversation with Ambika Satkuranathan, Dr. Parkesh Saramuthu, as well as attorney at law Tyagi Ruwan Patrina. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. Once we come back, we'll wrap up. And what is the way forward for Sri Lanka? All this and more after this short commercial break. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation.
Yes.
අපිට උනේ ගෞරවනීයත්වයේ නැතිවීමද එහෙම නැත්නම් අපිට බැරි හින්දා තවත් කෙනෙක් අපිව පාලනය කරන්නේ.
ඇල්ජීරියාවෙන් ප්‍රංශකාරයෝ ගියාට වැඩක් නැහැ කියලා. මොකද හේතුව ප්‍රංශ සංස්කෘතිය, ප්‍රංශ දේශපාලනය තනිකරම තියෙන්නේ කියලා ඇල්ජීරියාවේ.
අපිටත් උනේ
ඒකම.
දැන් මේ ලෝක බෙදලා ඉවරද දෙකට? නැත්නම් ඒ දෙකට කියන්නේ මේ යුක්‍රේනය හා රුසියාවත් එක්ක තමයි බෙදලා තියෙන්නේ. යුක්‍රේනය ආක්‍රමණය
අද ඔය නැවතත් කියනවා මේක යුක්‍රේනය හා රුසියාවද ප්‍රශ්නේ
නෙමෙයි. ඒක තමයි ප්‍රශ්නේ පේන්නේ. ප්‍රශ්නේ ස්වරූපය ඒකයි. ප්‍රශ්නේ මූලයන් තියෙන වෙන තැන.
ඒ සම්පත් තියෙනවා. ඔව් අපිට ඉස්සරහට
යන්න බෑ. හරියට හරි. ජාත්‍යන්තර වෙළඳපොළ ටාගට් කරනවා නම් එතන තියෙන්නේ gain of trade. භාණ්ඩයක් හරි සයවාවක් හරි විකුණලා ලබා ගන්න පුළුවන් වාසිය ඉහළ වෙන්න ඕන.
මම ඉතින් දේශපාලනඥයෙකුත් නෙවෙයි ආර්ථික විද්‍යාඥයෙකුත් නෙවෙයි.
හැබැයි දේශපාලනඥයෝ හොඳින් දන්නවා.
දේශපාලනඥයෝ
වැඩ කරේ කොහොමද කියලා.
හුඟක් හොඳට දන්නවා. ජනාධිපතිවරු 7 දිනක් එක්කම වැඩ කරපු එකම මිනිස්සයා මම හිතන්නේ රාජ්‍යස්කරිය හිටපු.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. නිතරම හොඳින් සබන් යොදා දෑත් සෝදන්න. සබන් හෝ විසබීජ නාශක මධ්‍යසාරයක් භාවිතා කර දෑත් පිරිසිදු කරන්න. සැම විටම අන් අය සමග මීටරයක දුරස්ථභාවයක් පවත්වා ගන්න. හැකි සෑම විටම නිවසේ රැඳී සිටින්න. නිරතුරුවම නිවැරදිව මුඛාවරණ පළඳින්න.
Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. I'm getting a lot of questions on the number 0766 565353. Unfortunately, I'm not able to take all the questions that are flowing in because some are very, very sensitive in nature. Hence, let's leave it at that and move to the final round of the show tonight. Let's start off the final round with Tyagi Ruwan Patrina, researcher, Amnesty International. What are your final thoughts?
I think it will be interesting to see what the government says in Geneva come 2 weeks' time at the UN Human Rights Council. Because usually they talk about how effective or how the operation, say for example, of the Office on Missing Persons is going, the Office on Reparations. Now they've been talking about the Office on National Unity and Reconciliation. They'll be talking about how they intend to repeal the PTA, that the human rights situation in this country is improving. So this is the context in which I'll be really surprised to see what the government has in store to tell the international community, because right now it's gone back on its promises and started using the PTA against protesters. We've not seen any sort of progress made on finding answers for those who've been forcibly disappeared, and any attempts to sort of say that the PTA has got better or they plan on, say, replacing it with another counterterrorism act or an anti-terror act. That's really going to be something where we're going to be interested to see when it's, you know, practically using a very draconian law against the largely peaceful protesters at this point. So that's something we'll be watching very closely.
Right, thank you very much, Tyagivan Patrina, researcher of Amnesty International. I now move attention to Ambika Satkaranathan, former commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka.
I would say, many people seem to think that this is a different government. We must give them a chance. But I would say it's pretty much the same government. It's ruled by Rajapaksa proxy. And what we have seen is that the president, the newish president, also using the same methods as the Rajapaksas and acting in unaccountable ways, abusing the law, using violence. Particularly when we are in the midst of severe economic crisis. We see a wastage also of state resources. So I think what the government must do, and particularly the president right now, is to respect the rule of law, to protect human rights, and to focus on what is important. We also see a worrying trend of, anti-minority, anti-Tamil, anti-Muslim rhetoric coming back, particularly on social media. Now, this is a common platform that even the Rajapaksas have used. So it's back to business as usual. So for those who are very happy with their 20 liters and their gas and 1 hour power cuts, I would say
3 hours. 3 hour power
well,
cuts.
now it's back to 3 hours, but we're going to be back at square one if we don't address the fundamental or the root causes of our problems and the reasons why we're here.
Thank you very much, Ambika Satkaranathan, former commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Dr. Pakiso Sararamuthu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives.
Well, as I've said before, we have a crisis of governance. And in terms of this government's approach, is it different to the previous government? I think Geneva will give us some kind of demonstration of the true nature of this government in terms of its ability to attract international goodwill, to protect human rights and all of that, to come out with a paradigm change, to show that things are different to what everyone has been saying insofar as the human rights record of the last 2 months has been concerned. I think Jonathan Swift talked about hypocrisy as a tribute that vice pays to virtue. The Rajapaksas did not have any hypocrisy. They came out quite blatantly and shamelessly and did what they wanted to do. Now, this government is supposed to be more sophisticated. It's supposed to be more friendly towards the West, and it's going to attract international goodwill and all of that. Will that actually happen? What is the government going to say in Geneva with regard to the PTA? How is it going to defend its record in terms of what has happened in the last 3 to 4 days? How is it going to square that circle? And that was going to be very interesting to see how it's going to be able to do that. Back at home, I think it has to start pulling up its socks. And I would say, pardon all of these people who have been taken in, because they haven't done anything as far as I can see, or the government has demonstrated to us. Pardon them, let them go. Let's bring the country together. If we are going to have to take tough measures, and we are being told that we will have to, we can't do it by dividing the country, by people living under a fear psychosis and all of that. We have to come together to rebuild the country. Then I think the government, apart from whatever the economic measures are that have to take place in terms of the bridging measures as well as the staff agreement, I think you have to come out and tell people that, look, this is our blueprint in terms of political reform, and this is how we're going to get there in terms of this is our timetable for elections. This is our timetable for elections, and we will go to the people and ask them for a mandate to abolish the executive presidency. That would then free up all the impediments that are there in the system with regard to governance. Because I think, out of adversity comes opportunity. And if we don't grasp this opportunity to be able to rebuild, then we're going to be really sunk. And we have to also recognize that rebuilding is not just a question of abolition of the executive presidency, elections, whatever the IMF says has to happen. We also have a long, outstanding national question that has to be resolved. And we can't let that also slide into oblivion. So it's a lot of things. It's a lot of fronts. But you have to have a government that is, who recognizes it and who comes up with a plan. We don't really have a proper vision for Sri Lanka. We're talking about 2048 as being 100 years since independence. But where is this country going to be? You know, everyone is trying to get out of it. And therefore what we need is a plan, a salvage plan to keep people inside and for them to realize that the grass is indeed greener on this side rather than on the other.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pakeso Saranamuthu. Thank you very much, Tyagi Patrina, Research Amnesty International. I'm extremely sorry and profusely sorry, Tyagi, for addressing you as attorney at law. And thank you very much for correcting us before the show finished. Thank you very much, Dr. Pakeso Saranamuthu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives, for joining us this evening on the show. It was a pleasure to have you on board as well, Dr. Sara. And Ambika Satguranathan, former Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Thank you very much for being vocal, Ambika. And as I said before, it's important for the guest to take a full right for the statements that John made tonight on the show. Thank you very much, Shehan, for putting up a great panel as always. And thank you very much for us for coming on the show as well. I'm not going to ask you who's your guest tomorrow on Newsline, because usually you don't know who the guest is.
No, actually we do know, but we like to leave it till the last moment so that we stay as close to current affairs as possible.
Let's leave it at that for us anyway. I don't want to comment on that. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us this evening on the show. You can always share your views, thoughts on the number 0766565353 and pose your questions on the show as well. 2 weeks from now, we are intending to speak about the IMF and what role the IMF will play in Sri Lanka as well. That's a surprise for you within 2 weeks from now, hopefully. And we'll leave it at that. I leave you tonight with the quote, as I always do. Don't be laid back about your rights. It's your right. Go and get it. Take care and good night.